Excuse me? Excuse me? But what does God need with a starship? Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Star Trek V The Final Frontier. This video is part of a series of videos where I review every Star Trek movie 1 week at a time. This week I had the distinct pleasure of reviewing one of the greatest masterpieces of all time, Star Trek V The Final Frontier. And of course, I'm joking. This is generally looked upon as the worst Star Trek movie. In fact, I would say there are few people who wouldn't say this is the worst Star Trek movie, and I would say you are incorrect. I wouldn't even put the reboots, crappy as is and as angry as they make me, well, particularly just 2009, which, get to in good time, this is not as bad as this film. This is one of the worst movies ever made. It's just really bad. Now, there are some good things about it, and there are people who have been pointing out, well, actually this scene's pretty good, and this actor is pretty good, and stuff like that, and that's true. It's not a complete and total piece of shit. Not quite, almost there, but, because it does have some strong points, but for the most part, it's just horrible. And a lot of people acknowledge it's horrible. A lot of people who were involved in the film, William Shatner himself, admits this is not a good movie. For those of you who don't know, William Shatner directed this film. And then a lot of other people were involved. I heard quotes from other people who helped create this movie, and they're just really like, we really fucked up on this one. Now, the thing is that Leonard Nimoy directed Star Trek 3 and Star Trek 4. And from interviews I heard, when William Shatner found out about this, he was not very happy. He was like, how come Leonard gets to direct? What's the deal? Now we're getting into Seinfeld. But anyway, so William Shatner is very notorious for having a huge ego, and apparently he wasn't happy that Leonard gets to direct, so he was like, I want to direct, so I was like, okay, fine, whatever, William, you can direct this one. Apparently, William Shatner was recounting one of his interviews that it was Leonard Nimoy's idea, that was because Leonard said, there's a clause in the contracts or whatever, you could use the same clause I did to direct, so you can direct the next one. That's how William Shatner tells it. I have a suspicion that the conversation went more like where William Shatner kept bugging Leonard. Well, how come you get, what makes you the director? Why you get the directors? Why should I listen to you? You're not a good director. Why are you the director? And Leonard's like, fine! You can direct the next film. Just leave me alone and go talk to producers and you can become the director. And it's like, okay, I'll do that. I have a suspicion that was more of what the conversation went out. Now, to be fair to William Shatner, a lot of the reason why this movie failed is not necessarily his fault. In fact, when hearing his initial idea for this film, I actually think it's a solid idea. I just don't think they executed it very well or went about it very well. So his idea was apparently he was watching the Bakers or whoever, I can't remember, I was too young at the time, but there was these very famous televangelists who turned out to be frauds and were stealing money from people. Oh, what a shocker. So his whole thought was to incorporate a theme of that into a Star Trek movie of people using, religion or God to sort of deceive people for their own benefit, which I think is a very powerful story that could be told in a Star Trek way very well and have really good strong social commentary, which is what Star Trek is best at. This isn't the way, though. They kind of went about it in a very poor way, because Sybok is not a good analogy for the Bakers because he actually believes in what he's saying. I guess you could say the God figure in they meet at the end is the Bakers because he's pretending to be God, but really he's just some asshole alien who wants off the planet. So it's a good concept, but it's executed very poorly. And then there's other things that are good concepts that are executed poorly, like the alien planet, the Nimbus 3, or whatever it's called, where there's a Romulan ambassador, a Klingon ambassador, and a Federation ambassador, and all on this planet, but the planet's like a hellhole. It has a very Mad Max feel to it. I think they were very successful in having that sort of feel. Like barren wasteland, vote, that kind of thing. So they got some things right, but then they got into cheesiness. The Klingon ambassador was burping or whatever, and it just the whole storyline fell apart. So my point is that there are makings of a good film here, but what they filmed looks like a first draft. I can't say for certain that it was. It could have been a first or second or third. But I think from what I hear, it pretty much is an early draft. And that's why it comes off as an early draft, because of the writer's strike. And I was reading about this, and that definitely is a huge factor on why this movie is not very good. And a lot of people say that William Shatner will come up with any excuse. But in this case, I think that excuse is valid. Because apparently the writers were not able to work on this film as long as it needed to. And because of the writer's strike. And so they're like, well, fuck it. We're on a timetable. We have to shoot what we have. And I think it's very obvious that the script needed hell of a lot more work. I think it would have been possible to make this into a good film, but they needed to change a lot. Not just a little bit, but a lot. But because of the writer's strike, they weren't able to get the time to do so. So here we go. Giant piece of shit. Another thing, which factors into why this movie comes off as incredibly cheesy, is that the studio tried to shove in a lot of humor, a lot of jokes, because of Star Trek 4. Star Trek 4 came before a huge smash hit, which I just talked about, and owed a lot of success to its comedy, so of course the studio's like, well, we need to see that comedy again. And you add that into, okay, so you had to shove in comedy into a story that wasn't originally intended to have comedy, and you don't have much time to do it because of the writer's strike. Therefore, you get a lot of jokes that suck. The humor, the attempted humor, I should say, in this film is just awful. It is cringeworthy. It is horrible. Some people like the row row your boat scene. I heard some people quote that. It's not too bad, but a lot of the other stuff, like Chekhov going, "Oh, we're lost. There's a storm," and blowing it. That's dumb. And like Scotty saying, "Oh, I know this ship like the back of my hand," and then knocking into the thing. That's like cartoon humor. And then here's another point I wanted to bring up, is I saw this movie in the theaters when it first came out when I was 9 years old, and I liked it. I was like, I usually didn't like Star Trek back then when I was that young, but I was like, that's a good movie. I remember telling my friend this at school who was a Star Trek fan. He's like, really? You like that movie? And to my, to make an excuse for my 9-year-old self, this does come off as a kid's movie. And watching it again, I can kind of see why a 9-year-old would like this film. Because it's very immature, it's very bare bones, it does come off as a cartoon. Most of all, the Klingons, the Clee, or whatever the fuck his name is, those are like the most childish, cartoonish villains I've ever seen. I think he was like number 2 in my worst villain Star Trek video. I doesn't beat out Nero. He's definitely number 1. But when I did like the worst Star Trek Klingon episodes, even though this isn't an episode, it's a movie, I had to put this at number 1 because this is the worst portrayal of the Klingons. They come off as cartoonish, childish. Like at the end, the ambassador makes him apologize like he's a schoolyard bully. Like, go ahead and apologize. Like, I apologize for my action. Why does he go after Kirk? Oh, I want to make... It makes no sense. The plot makes no sense. There's a Klingon ambassador being held hostage. So he wants to go to this planet so he can attack the Federation or attack Starfleet. What? What? Oh, I'm going to fight Kirk. Sorry, I need some targets practice because I'm going to be cool and make a name for myself. That's just the worst motivation for a villain ever. And a lot of this film, and the humor is very childish, very immature, very... Yeah, so I can see why children would like this. But as an actual film, no. just no. Now, as I said, there's some good concepts in it. Like, everyone, when they point to positives, they always point to the scene where Sybok is trying to have McCoy feel his pain, and they had the flashback to where his father was dying, and it was a very emotional scene. It was played very well, and I'll agree that is definitely a high point of the film. And some of the other stuff with Sybok, having the feel your pain and him being totally... And I will give credit, even though I named Sybok as one of the worst Trek villains too, I will give credit to the actor. He does do a good job. He was trying his best with this really shitty material that he was given of portraying Sybok. But the whole concept of Spock having a half-brother or adopted sister, something different, is ridiculous. It's so stupid. And it's like even Kirk in this film was like, well, you don't have a brother. It's like, well, and it's the Vulcan that feels emotion. And that's a hard sell to begin with, so blame Shatner because that's his idea. In fact, originally, he had wanted Spock to side with Sybok from the beginning and betray Kirk, and Leonard Nimoy flat out refused to do that. He's like, I am not going to play that, because Spock would not do that after Kirk just risked his life to save him. That is some horseshit right there, and you gotta commend Leonard Nimoy for that, at the very least. And of course, oh god, I didn't even mention that cringeworthy scene where Uhura gets naked and dances. Now, I don't mean to do age shaming or anything. I think it's great, but still, like, I'll just leave it at that. You know what I'm saying. But regardless, that's something you see in a cartoon. Oh, here, let's have the foxy woman come and distract the guard so he can go, ooh, and eyes shoot out of his head, and so the people can get by. It's very, very, like, elementary, very childish, very ridiculous. It's just so dumb. And the whole, let's sing with the thing, so everyone's like, oh, there's a naked woman, let's go run and drop our guns. So there's a lot to hate about this film, and the whole humor is awful. But here's another thing, like, they're kind of playing off of Scotty and Uhura relationship in this film. And I don't think they did in any other film. It made me think that they were actually kind of implying they got a little something going. And the thing is, like, after I saw this film, I saw the Next Generation episode, Conspiracy, where in the future, Next Generation times, there is a African-American woman who's a captain, Starfleet captain, named Captain Scott. So when I saw that, I was like, hey, wait a second. Is that the offspring of Uhura and Scotty? But they never, because it made me think of the Uhura and Scotty, because they were kind of getting bit close in the Final Frontier. But now, in retrospect, Conspiracy actually came out before the Final Frontier, because the Final Frontier came out when Next Generation was having its second season. So maybe that, I don't know. I don't know if that's what they were implying with this Captain Scott, or maybe they saw that and said, hey, maybe we should have these two try to get together. I don't know. But, I don't know, there's something to think about. But, speaking of Next Generation, so this is actually a very bad time for Star Trek. I reckon that the whole franchise was in peril after this movie. Because you gotta think. 4 was a huge success, a huge hit, and I just talked about how Next Generation owes its existence of 4. But then 3 years later, you have The first 2 seasons of Next Generation, now for those of you who aren't familiar, who weren't alive or not really into what was going on, which I was too young. I didn't give a shit about Star Trek at the time. Anyway, is that the Next Generation was met with a lot of skepticism. You know, all the people saying, "Oh, Discovery is not Star Trek. It hates canon. It violates canon. They're pissing on Star Trek." People were doing the exact same thing. Just as many people as well, if not more. To be perfectly frank, they just didn't have the internet to do it with. There were protests against the Next Generation, and people were saying, "This is not my Star Trek." And because for them, they're like, Star Trek is Kirk, McCoy, and Spock, and Scotty. It is not the bald British guy or fucking Kirk look-alike, some Klingon, whatever. That's bullshit, and there's some pale-faced android motherfucker trying to be like Spock. Fuck this shit. That is not Star Trek. And now I'll get off of a rant on Discovery and how people are just doing the same thing with that. But I digress. Point is, Next Generation was not doing so well. And if you go back and watch the first 2 seasons, you can see why. The first 2 seasons are awful. They're horrible. They're really bad. There's a few good episodes here and there, like Measure of a Man. But, like, all the best, you look back on Next Generation as a whole, all the best episodes, pretty much a lot of top 20s, top 10. Some of them will put Measure of the Man or Q-Who, which I disagree with, but some of them will put those two in there. But pretty much anything from the first or second seasons, any top 10, top 20 will have third season and beyond, with those two exceptions I just mentioned. Well, actually, I saw them watch Mojo had a kind of far point in there, which is total bullshit. That episode's not even that good. But anyway, most people agree that the first 2 seasons were not good, and they got good after the third season. So, we're in 1989. Next Generation's second season just aired, or was airing, and then this giant piece of shit comes out. Star Trek franchise is in trouble. It could have all ended right here, folks. It could have been like, oh my god, first 2 seasons of this horrible show that nobody likes, they're all protesting, and then you have this giant piece of shit. It's amazing. If it wasn't for the amazing third season of Next Generation, the amazing turnaround of Michael Piller and all the new writers, Brennan Braga, Ronald D. Moore, Iron Stephen Bear, all the who become titans in the Star Trek universe, coming in and saving the Next Generation, and Roddenberry having a lesser role. That's the important part as well. Then Star Trek could have died. And we would have had no Star Trek 6, there would be no Generations, there'd be no Deep Space Nine, anything. It could have died right here. And I reckon there wouldn't have been a Star Trek 6 if it wasn't for Next Generation becoming such a smash hit. Next Generation is what saved the original series movies, because the original series movies would have been dead after this film, because this film was an abomination. Nobody wanted to watch another Star Trek film. The Next Generation had to bring the interest back into Star Trek in order for 6 to be made. That is for damn sure. Apparently, like, Harve Bennett didn't want to do this movie, because apparently he had falling out with a few people, including Leonard Nimoy, which I didn't realize. And William Shatner was all on board and found some way to get him to do it. And yeah, it turned out to be an absolute disaster. But you know what? Gene Roddenberry, who I mentioned before, he didn't like Star Trek 2, didn't like Star Trek 3, didn't like Star Trek 4. He was actively protesting against all of those. But Star Trek 5 is the one he protested the most. He hated this film, and this time, for good reason. I'm going to have to agree with that. Some people think it's ironic. I've heard some people say it's ironic that Gene Roddenberry hated this movie so much because it portrayed his atheistic views the most. His sort of anti-religion, if you will, views the most. But the thing is, is that this film was a lot more heavy-handed. As I said, the concept of doing like a Baker type story is good, but the way they handled it was not good. It was horrible. And so I totally agree. Like the way Roddenberry would have done it would have been a lot more subtle, a lot more sort of strong social commentary. So I don't think it's contradictory at all that he tried to stop this piece of shit from being made. Of course, he also absolutely hated Star Trek VI even more, and apparently said that he would have went even further to stop that film had he not sadly passed away at that time. But I'll get a bit more into that when I get into Star Trek VI. But anyway, this is a point in time where I actually agree with him that, yeah, this film sucked. I think everyone agrees. I don't know. I've heard some defenders, like beyond the, that one scene with McCoy's father, and some of the Sybok stuff works, but. And I think, like, the idea of the whole Shakari thing is a good idea, but the way it was executed was... And plus, having, like, the mind control, like, they mind controlled the crew just so easily, and I've seen... It's something that's so cliche. It's been done a billion times before, and it's just done so bad here. Anyway, sick of talking about this film. My rating for Star Trek V, The Final Frontier, out of 10 is a 2. Very poor. No, extremely poor. I'm sorry, extremely poor. Not quite a 1, as I said. The McCoy scene and the Sybok stuff, some of the Sybok stuff was good, but the whole concept of Sybok was pretty dumb. The whole way this was executed was very dumb. The humor was awful. The Klingon villains were awful. Pretty much everything about this film, pretty much everything, not everything, but pretty much everything was awful. Bad film, by far the worst Star Trek film ever made. I think anyone who says otherwise, especially if they say Nemesis, could not be more wrong. But I'll get to Nemesis in due time. Anyway, that is it for my review of Star Trek V, The Final Frontier. I'll be back in roughly a week's time for Star Trek VI and Discovery Country, and every week after that until I cover all these Star Trek films. In the meantime, you can check out my channel for many other reviews on other shows like Game of Thrones, The Expanse, Babylon 5, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.